United Way Mass Bay is determined to make an impact, to inspire communities to be the very best versions of themselves. They listen to the voices that can actually make that happen. Community leaders, educators, and the neighbors that live, work, and thrive in these places. Those are the voices that matter, and those are the voices that United Way Mass Bay listens to. And because they're listening, they're creating a new kind of philanthropy. See what's new at unitedwaymassbay.org/what's new.
This week, I found the phrase, "In the spring, a young man's fancy lightly turns to thoughts of love," going through my head. So I reread the Lord Tennyson poem Locksley Hall again for, I think, the first time in maybe 15 years. And although the full phrase, speaking of bright robins' breasts and burnished doves, is among the most famed stanzas in English poetry and has a distinctly rosy hue, the whole story is one of rejection and yearning in the space between the desires of young love and their deficiencies. Anyway, we're here to talk about breakups and diamonds and why a broken engagement is the business of the state's highest court. I'm Jennifer Smith, and this is the Codcast, Commonwealth Beacon's podcast about policy and civic life here in Massachusetts. Today, I'm joined by Meredith Goldstein, advice columnist for the Boston Globe. She writes the Love Advice column and hosts the podcast, both called Love Letters. Caveat, we're talking as a relationship and court reporter, not lawyers, so there will be some blurring between legal and colloquial use of words like fault or agreement or condition. I'll try to be clear about that, and let's get into it. Meredith, thank you so much for coming on the Codcast to talk about a low-key, strange period in relationships, engagement.
Yes. What a weird time that I feel grateful I've never had to deal with.
I had a great time looking back at some of your columns specifically about engagement and some of the strange things there, because obviously, as an advice columnist, you consider questions about all stages of relationships, but is there something about the engagement period that feels particularly fraught, like the symbology, the wedding planning, the idea that you've decided to change your legal state, but technically you're still just dating with more planning involved? Like, what is it about that time?
Well, it has changed over the years, I'll say, but there's still something really loaded about it, because for as much as we have evolved in meaning of relationship, who does what, gender roles, there is something, especially in straight people relationships, that leaves responsibilities of asking and accepting to certain people. And yes, there are absolutely many women who've proposed to men, all of this. But again, when you hear that, it still seems pretty unusual. And it's also framed in a way that one person is going out on a limb and the other is saying yes or no. And trust me, I fully believe that most couples know what the answer is going to be before they do it. So then it's a performance. Then it's a performance of romance. But along with marriage, it's a complicated thing because it's tied to romance, especially now, but also it's a legal thing. It's a business contract. So I think the minute we begin to enter into that contract, it is a very awkward line to dance down of, is this business? Is this pleasure? And who benefits and whose responsibility is it to keep this going?
In your experience and your opinion, and in the context of the advice column, do people seem to understand, or do you understand the engagement as kind of a pre-part of marriage or a post-part of dating? Like, thinking about that sort of slow-rolling contract question, where is this fitting?
This is an assumption based on my letter writers. I think they see it as pre-marriage. You know, for so many couples, there's this will we or won't we, or we're really serious, but there's like this one missing piece. And I've seen so many couples, especially when they're young, it's almost like, are we going to break up or be together forever? And there's like, they get to this point in their relationship, whether it's a few years in or more than that, of like, are we going to take that next leap? And the minute there is an engagement, there is like this exhale of, okay, now we've just decided. That is the prevailing feeling I hear of all this angst about whether to do it. And then once it's decided, at least for that phase, you're now in the planning of how we're going to get married, where we're going to get married, who gets to be there, how much do we want to spend. But you have figured out, okay, next phase. I love and think the most romantic thing ever is a couple that is together for decades, never felt the need to do it. And even if it's for health insurance reasons, they decide to do it. And what they are actually celebrating is an anniversary that it seems irrelevant, right? You know, I have relatives who may get married after many, many, many years just to make sure they're tied together, but like it would not mark the start of something.
So the reason that we're talking about this is because the highest court in the state, the Supreme Judicial Court, is considering a really niche area of law this week, which is going to be engagement rings specifically. So we're talking about rings. So why don't you kind of, first off, tell me what your general understanding is, or what people are bringing to you in an advice perspective when they're thinking about the ring itself as an item. What do they understand is happening when someone hands them an engagement ring?
We used to have this thing in the column where the commenters would say ring watch because somebody would write in and they were on ring watch. They were waiting. This is this token of we're in for this, right? And yet the history of it is really sort of silly and fascinating. And I highly encourage anybody to read J. Courtney Sullivan's book. I believe it's called The Engagements, which actually gets a little bit into the fact that the person who came up with that slogan of like 2 months salary or 3 months, whatever it's supposed to be, was in marketing, right? Was part of the diamond industry, right? So we all know that we've been manipulated into this. You must spend a ton of money to show that your significant other is going to be your partner for life, and yet we do it, right? We may do it in different ways. We may find ethical jewels. We may I've seen very modest and different rings. I've seen tattoos, right? But it's still a huge showing. It's also something people look at, right? They put in an Instagram photo. Here's what happened. Here's what it is. I happen to be someone who does not notice jewelry very much. If you want to feel better about whatever, like I just don't notice it. But for people to whom it's important, it is important. And yet 100 things can happen before the wedding date. You know, we can ask Mr. Affleck in the moment right now, right, of, you know, engagements or marriages that don't turn out the way we plan. And then there's this thing that's like a thing that belongs in a museum.
And so to think about this from kind of a set of facts perspective here, the case that's going to be in front of the court, to keep it brisk here, man and woman dated. He bought a $70,000 Tiffany engagement ring and proposed with it. She says yes. Things start getting uncomfortable pretty quickly. She noted behaviors he didn't like. He noticed behaviors she didn't like. And these also kind of involved seemingly like sniping and a bunch of things that happen when a relationship decomposes. But fundamentally, it reached a head when she allegedly said that she was an attractive lady who could get any guy that she wanted. He then went through her phone, found text and voice memos to a man he'd never met that to him indicated an affair. She says she's talking to her best friend of 40 years. The man ends the engagement over voicemail, saying he felt disrespected and couldn't trust her, and notably here, sues for the ring back. So there are, I can only imagine, 75 different red flags going on in that set of facts here. And it might feel surprising to people that this suddenly became like a public fight in a lot of ways. I mean, what's immediately sort of jumping out? Not from a legal perspective, but if somebody said, hey, this is how it happened and things seem to be getting really bad really fast, is your inclination to say like, well, tough it out? What's your perspective when it comes to engagement advice?
I don't believe like the sunk cost fallacy thing is real, right? Like if you are going through somebody's phone, like right before you're supposed to be making a lifetime commitment, if you're miserable, if you're like, all of these things can be undone. I have interviewed people who have canceled weddings day of, like in the movies. Like it's totally okay and better to say, this isn't it. And even though we've made a big show of this and that, it's okay. Like it's painful and it's hurtful and there are bad feelings. But like, I remember years ago, my friend's European husband said to me, sometimes I feel like Americans get married as a bet. And I don't really, I wish I knew more about what his basis of comparison was, right? But like he was like, you know, you have these massive weddings and you put everything on the line, and often the relationship is kind of new, and you just are like, I bet the $150,000 wedding and the $70,000 ring that this is going to be okay. And it's exciting. I'm somebody who would love to spend all that money on a 20-year anniversary or a 10-year anniversary. I mean, it's, when things are still going well. So
do you get very frustrated whenever that show Marriage or Mortgage shows up and you're basically like, absolutely take the house? Do you know what the housing environment is like in California or Massachusetts?
I'm a hypocrite. I'm an unmarried person who says, who believes very strongly in romance, who also loves to go to a wedding. I love to go to my friends' weddings. I am like blissed out on the spectacle of celebrating something wonderful. And especially when you can tell the people are really excited to be there. So I can see all sides of this, which is maybe those couples would now say, wow, I wish we'd spent slightly less on the marriage or the wedding and had more for the mortgage. But I get it. I think it's also, especially after 2020 and the few years after that, it feels so decadent to be in a room of so many people that you care about who are all there to celebrate two people. So I get it. I'm not so cynical that I would say, that's not worth doing.
This kind of initial inciting exchange, if you're thinking about the handover of the ring, the law on this is really interesting. A bunch of people don't realize that there are actually tons and tons of court decisions all across the country specifically considering engagement rings because they are, in most states, considered to be what's called a conditional gift. That means somebody presumably bought/inherited it, gave it to another person on the promise that they would get married. So the presumption in courts, with a little bit of complication involved, is that generally speaking, the person who bought it gets it back. But you had mentioned sort of this symbology change as the dating world changes. So does the general idea of this is an agreement we're making, here's the big rock to seal the deal, it's mine if we don't end up getting married, does that seem to square with how people are still talking about it? Is there still that traditional element still?
I mean, I'm going to generalize here because I think each case is very specific. And I think if you're going old fashioned and one person is giving the engagement ring to another and it is about a promise and that promise isn't fulfilled, it does seem like a conditional gift. I think a little bit about weddings that are canceled after people buy things from a registry, or a marriage that ends really quickly and you say, wow, I bought the KitchenAid mixer for them, but of course, if you're close with them, you may say, wow, now the breakup couple gets to have their own KitchenAid mixer in one house and the new pillows in another, and you want to support your friends anyway through their breakup. But in the case of an engagement ring, and again, I'm not a Supreme Judicial Court justice, may shock you, and I'm sure there are exceptions to this rule for me, but for the most part, it is still an old-fashioned thing that is about a promise. And if the promise is unfulfilled, it's unfulfilled. Now, in this case, this idea that poor behavior and bad treatment should be weighed in with this. Like, do I get it because somebody was unkind? Do I get it because they went through my phone? Like, that's an interesting thing, but that also seems like, well, maybe you don't get the ring, but there's some other thing. Well, or maybe if you've been living with that person, like maybe there's something closer to alimony. There is a reason that so many courts have said, oh, this was a conditional gift.
So this is maybe an odd aside, but when I've talked to people about this story this past week, the thing that everybody has agreed on is that the ring feels different than other gifts, even other gifts that are exchanged in the context of a relationship. So, you don't generally demand the return of, say, a necklace, even if you only bought it for someone in the context of a relationship heading to marriage, because the understanding is, well, I didn't buy you this necklace and say, if I buy you this necklace, you will get married to me.
Yeah, that's a gift
right?
to me.
That's the framework.
Right? Yeah, that's a gift.
Exactly.
And does that mean that you should be saying, well, I don't really want an engagement ring, but you're welcome to buy me jewelry? Well, that's pretty cynical too, right? Are you expecting to want to take it from the person? I always wonder, there was an episode of Sex and the City way back in the day in that era where Charlotte uses her engagement ring money. She sells it and gives Carrie the money to help her buy a condo. My mother at the time said, maybe I'll sell my engagement ring. She's, was divorced from my father, and help you buy a condo. And I was laughing and I was like, your engagement ring the value is not the same as this fictional ring on television.
Who does not want a ring that's worth as much as a condo? My goodness.
I was like, what does your engagement ring from Dad look like? And I'm like, Mom, I think we could buy like a really good Whole Foods run. Like, I don't know that this. So in this specific case, yes, the ring is quite valuable, but for so many people who are not buying that kind of ring, I always say, like, what are we, let's think about what we're fighting over too. And maybe what we want is help with rent to move out of the place so it's easier to navigate out of the relationship. But to your point, this is different. This is a different spiritual promise. And it's part of a tradition that, whether I buy into it or not, or whether I think it's more of an honoring of something, right? It's about, let's do this. And this is a promise. It's like a promise ring of when you're young and in the 50s or whenever they did that. I don't know when they did that.
It also seemed to me when writing about this that there's something a little bit grim about thinking of any relationship in terms of it ending and assets needing to be redistributed almost, because rings can be complicated, prenups can be stressful, but it seems like a layer over everything else. And I was wondering, and I'd love your take on this, when you think about giving advice about relationships, how do you tend to approach the question of sometimes it doesn't work? How deep in are you? That sunk cost fallacy, sometimes as a literal thing and sometimes as more of a spiritual thing.
We did an interesting podcast episode within the last year or two. We talked to a couple that they said their prenup was the most romantic thing they'd ever done. And it really proved a point I hoped someone would make, which was that they both had a lot of trust issues from previous traumas. They were very much in love. One of them didn't even know if she ever wanted to get married. And he was like, let's get all the prenups in the world. Basically, let's get the biggest prenup that lets you know that on any given day you could go. And you could go safely with as much money as you need and without, worrying. And that's what they did. And what that means is that every day they show up, it's by choice. And there is something so romantic to them about the fact that either of them could just bail easily and probably with some profit because of what they've invested in over the course of the marriage. But every day they wake up and choose to be together. And I find that quite romantic, that you're not there after a certain amount of time because you have to be and because of the sunk cost fallacy and because you're like so far in, but because you want to be there. So that's one piece of it. I think the other piece of it is that I like talking about this stuff with people because it's like I want these choices to be romantic, and yet the minute the relationship doesn't work out, it's a business decision that you made. So suddenly it's like, well, now you're dealing with lawyers and contracts. And I think it's really important for people getting married to read what they're signing. That sounds obvious, but someone close to me is going through a divorce right now, and I was reading her divorce paperwork, and it was so enlightening about what you're really signing into when you get married, which is all the love and family and sharing and all of this stuff. But it's also like you can have that without some of these other contractual things. So are these contractual things something you want? Often they are, right? Like often it's fine. But I think a lot of people like to pretend the business piece of it and the legal piece of it is like an aside, when in fact it's the whole thing. It's the reason you're doing it and not just staying together romantically and having a commitment ceremony that has nothing to do with the law.
Right. When I was in law school, my estates professor would consistently chant over Zoom, because this was during the pandemic, just prenup, prenup, prenup. Yep. Always get a prenup, just consistently. I am interested as well, because we talked kind of in passing about this idea of fault here, because when it comes to rings and plenty of other things that have to do with marriage, even though Massachusetts is a no-fault divorce state, the question of how we define fault, how we think about fault emotionally gets pretty complicated. So as background, for those who don't know, Massachusetts is one of the states that still applies this fault-based analysis to figure out in court who gets the engagement ring back. Whatever amount it is, that's how it's basically decided. So in theory, if the person who bought it is at fault, they can't reclaim the ring. It overrides that sort of essential presumption that if you bought it, you get it back. But wow, is fault a complicated question? Does that just mean you're the one who called it off? Did you have to do it for unfair reasons? Is it enough to just be right or wrong about specifically infidelity? Like, how does it strike you when people start talking about fault?
Well, any letter I get to my column, everybody's at fault, right? The person writing in is an angel. The person they're writing about is the devil. But then maybe paragraph 3, they're like, but also, right? So, and there are cases where one person is obviously at fault, but fault is complicated, and you would know more, but I would imagine that the definition of fault has a lot to do with things that are very misogynistic and not cool, and what did that horrible woman do? I like, it's like witch hunty stuff. So I worry about that. Now, I like a state that's like, this is how we're doing it and there's no ambiguity. Where if you want to go do a civil suit about what you lost during the course of the relationship, that seems like a separate thing from the who gets what. What I do think might be interesting is if someone buys the $70,000 engagement ring as a promise and they themselves say, I don't want to do this anymore. They have not fulfilled their promise. Does that mean they can take the ring back? Does it mean not? That so often we think of the promise of getting married and as, well, you give the ring back because you didn't go through with it. But this is like who. So I happen to not like the conversation about fault for obvious reasons, which is like, you start getting into, but you were in a bad mood on Sundays. Like, what is the misdeed? And to me, the real question here is, did it happen or not? Because otherwise, it's like it encourages the parties to start pointing and saying, but you did this, but you did that, but I did this, but you did that, and then it's just really muddy.
Right. So this actually played out throughout these different levels of court proceeding, and I'm sure it's going to play out again on the September 6th, which is when this goes to oral argument before the High Court. So the appeals court overturned a lower court ruling that basically said the man was at fault in part because he, in the court's view, was wrong about the affair. Basically, like literally you called it off and you were wrong, so to speak, about the reasons why. The upper court said we should actually be looking at whether it was reasonable for him to want out. Were there reasons for that? And the quote was, sometimes there is just no fault to be had. And so you can see how that gets very, very muddy. And the question that really troubled one of the dissenting justice and the appeals court is, should it ultimately be up to a court to go rooting around in personal lives to find out who's at fault here? Because they said, no, that sort of seems unseemly, and we're specifically a no-fault divorce state. So the idea is there something that should be treated differently about fault in engagements versus fault in marriage? But the argument that the woman was making, exactly to your point, Meredith, is, well, a fault-based analysis might lead into a kind of sexist bunch of tropes here. This idea of like, well, how much did she need to talk to another man for you to be justified to call it off? That sort of question. So thinking about the muddiness and who kind of should be or can be like rooting around in the details of a relationship, because you yourself, of course, are being asked to sort of root around or consider the details as presented to you in relationships. So you say you don't like a fault-based analysis. So what does that look like when people are trying to actually litigate, in a non-legal sense, fault?
I think it's bad. I hope we can change our ways of doing this, especially now. Like, you think about Massachusetts being so evolved in so many of our, of the laws we've created, of the different policies we've created. We do gay marriage first, right? We do, this Somerville-based polyamory. You can have more than one domestic partner, and this was, created during COVID to make sure there's a huge polyamory community in Massachusetts and in Somerville specifically. And they wanted to make sure people could see their multiple partners in the hospital during COVID. So we have all this like really first in the country kind of stuff. And then every now and then I will find a Massachusetts law that's like ye old Massachusetts law. And I don't know if this is still in the books, but I remember learning that if you were born out of wedlock, your birth certificate is not public.
Oh, yeah. There are all sorts of strange ones like that. I mean, just recently, the governor just signed a parentage law that clarifies, for instance, what parent you're allowed to put down on a birth certificate, for instance, if you're in a same-sex couple or something like that. So it's still very much a process of retooling.
Let's talk about fault in this situation, right? We're talking about this in the context of two people who we assume are in an exclusive, intimate relationship, sexually and emotionally, I assume. So now we're saying, well, what if this was playing out with somebody who was in an open relationship? What if it was, how are we to know the boundaries they came up with, right? And what is really, like, it's not as simple. And there are, by the way, people who write me letters and comment on the column who truly believe that men and women inherently can't be friends. I mean, we are still 99% of the world, I'd like to believe, or at least a solid 99% of the people I know, and maybe less of the world understands that that's ridiculous. But there are people who believe that. So who gets to litigate what this woman is texting to a friend about her miserable relationship and the decline of it? This is very scary to me. So in some ways, again, like in some ways, I wonder if the ring is the thing that should be at stake here, because like if this I get why she's pursuing this. And, she's saying, you did not fulfill this promise based on a bunch of ideas that messed with me. And if anything, I should, I don't have to give this back. But again, it is this complicated. And I would never want I would never want a court to get to say, here's how a normal relationship works and here's what fault looks like in a normal relationship, especially now that we know people have not been doing relationships the way we assume they have been. And as we make things more accepted and you're able to talk about, oh, well, yes, my relationship was open for these years and then it wasn't. And we learn that more and more people don't live by a specific set of rules where I did this, he did this, and therefore I am owed this. It's just much blurrier than that.
Right. And we're very much at a precipice in this question too, because the court is not basically being asked, the highest court in the state is not saying you get the ring, you don't get the ring. What they're actually trying to consider is, should we even be using a fault-based analysis here? And so I think that's really fascinating. And the thing to end on, to me at least, is it seems like this is an unusual instance of a private relationship issue getting forced into the legal and public eye because of the way we think about relationships, agreement, marriage, symbology, and, hot take, structuring lives, very related to social policy. So after all of this, if somebody asks you, what is an engagement ring and why does it matter? Where do you find yourself?
I mean, I am where I've always been, which is, if this is something that's important to you that you like, that's so great. If somebody is saying to me, but will I get it if we break up? I would obviously worry from the beginning of why they're asking me that question. But I hear this and I assume it's a conditional gift if I am asked, because that seems to be the tradition of it. And I know traditions have changed so many times, but that seems to be what we're working with, and that it is very different from, I would love to know all of the pieces of jewelry that went into this relationship or didn't go into this relationship. But I think for me, the whole tradition is just so interesting of giving that ring. So many, in straight relationships specifically, and I want to say that because so many people will say to me, oh, well, I picked out this entire ring. I did the whole process. Sometimes they have even paid for the engagement ring. So then, of course they're keeping it, right? It's it's their ring. They bought themselves. So it's just, I hope we get to a place where fault is not something that anyone is interrogating. And I just say also, I think I am where I've always been. It's you might opt in to do it. Understand that once you get into the marriage part of this and the promises of marriage, it all becomes something to talk about legally. And how fascinating that the minute you step up your commitment, the romance kind of secretly goes out the window a little bit, because it becomes something that is a little bit businesslike. And there's no way around that, not to be Debbie Downer.
Perfect. I love ending on a downer note. That's excellent. Thanks again to Meredith Goldstein for joining me on the Codcast. Thank you for listening. I'm Jennifer Smith. Our producer is John Gee. Leave a rating and review wherever you're hearing this now if you want to help other folks find us, and email codcast@commonwealthbeacon.org if you ever want to get in touch directly. We'll be back in your ears next week. Have a great holiday weekend.